Hello, I'm Stephen Best, the director of Berkeley's Townsend Center for the Humanities. Welcome to Berkeley's Book Chat series. For this fall semester, we'll be hosting the book chats remotely while construction's completed on Stevens Hall. Our hope, of course, is to return to hosting these events in person starting next spring, but we appreciate your joining us online. Before we begin today's conversation, I'd like to mention a few upcoming events. Our next book chat will take place a week from today on September 28th, when we'll be joined by Kate Heslop, a professor in the Scandinavian department. Kate will be speaking with her colleague Jonas Wellendorf about her recent book, Viking Mediologies, A New History of Skaldic Poetics. I also wanted to kind of make an announcement for the grad students in our audience. We'll be hosting a 2-day workshop at the Townsend Center on public speaking for grad students with Laura Dolas. And I just wanted to remind people that the deadline to apply for that workshop is October 1st. But today we're delighted to hear Matthew Specter, Senior Fellow at the Institute for European Studies, discuss his recent book, The Atlantic Realists, Empire and International Political Thought Between Germany and the United States. Matthew is in conversation with Niels Gilman, Vice President of Programs at the Berggruen Institute, where he directs the Institute's resident fellowship program. I want to thank both of them for joining us today. And with that, I hand it over to you, Niels.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So I'm delighted to be here today with Matthew Specter. I'll introduce Matthew briefly, and then we can dive right into the content of this wonderful book of Matt's, The Atlantic Realists. Matthew is a historian of modern Europe with expertise in 20th century German political thought and the global history of international thought. As Stephen mentioned, he's a senior fellow at the Institute for European Studies at Berkeley and a lecturer in history at Santa Clara University, as well as the associate editor of History and Theory, the journal. He received his PhD in history from Duke in 2006, has also taught at George Mason and Central Connecticut State University before coming to Berkeley 5 years ago. In addition to The Atlantic Realists, which we'll be discussing today, he's also the author of an intellectual biography of Jürgen Habermas and has contributed chapters to edited volumes, including the Oxford Handbook of Carl Schmitt, and we'll be getting into Carl Schmitt, I'm sure, a little bit more in today's conversation, as well as in Fascism in America, Past and Present, and we may get to that as well. He's also edited and published reviews in a variety of different journals, including History and Theory, Modern Intellectual History, Constellations, the Journal of Modern History, as well as writing for broader audiences in journals like Dissent and Los Angeles Review of Books. So I'm delighted and honored to be able to be in conversation with Matthew about his new book, which I've been talking to him about for years as he was preparing the book. And so it's great to actually hear in the paper flesh, as it were. And let me just begin so that the audience, I mean, I assume many of the audience have read it, but some have not. So probably we should start by just having you summarize a little bit of the book. And let me frame that, because one of the things I found interesting as a myself is the play of different ideas that you have going on here. So realism is obviously the centerpiece of the book, but there's a series of different kinds of politics, Politik in German, that come up through the book. Realpolitik, Machtpolitik, Weltpolitik, Geopolitik on the one hand, and this constellation of different kinds of politics that are being imagined by realists on both sides of the Atlantic. And on the other hand, there's also different kinds of space that are being imagined. So there's Lebensraum, Grossraum, Herrschaftsraum that are being imagined, again, in different iterations by intellectuals and policy wonks on both sides of the Atlantic over the last 125 years. Tell us about the argument of the book and how this set of ideas and in dialogue with each other, both in terms of the ideas themselves and in terms of the communities of scholars.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you to Townsend Humanities Center for having me, and thank you to Niels, who I asked to be my interlocutor today because he's a wonderful intellectual historian who's engaged with questions of contemporary policy and foreign policy, and so he was the ideal choice for me. Thank you to the directors, Stephen Best and Rebecca Egger, and to the whole team that's made this possible. And thank you also to the audience for coming. I've been struggling a bit with how to summarize the argument of my book. In a way that there are a lot of sub-arguments, but at a meta level, I would say that the argument of the book is firstly that realism has a history. So that is to say, political theorists speak about a tradition called political realism, and this is a tradition that is as old as Thucydides. It sort of typically is narrated as going through St. Augustine, Machiavelli, Hobbes, up into figures like Max Weber, Carl Schmitt, and then up until even to people like Bernard Williams and Raymond Goyce. And the conceit of intellectual history is often to say that abstract genealogy sort of flattens out a lot of the differences in the history. Furthermore, I think realism has a tendency to describe itself as a kind of transcendental posture, to simply either be prudent or pragmatic, or accept that there's a gap between what Weber called the ethics of conviction and the ethics of responsibility, right? So the first move is to say realism has a history. Secondly, the second move is to say other historians have also given realism a history, but they've gotten it wrong, right? So the sort of the two arguments that I'm the two counter narratives I'm working with are, first, the idea of an unbroken tradition of realism in international political thought, from Thucydides to Hobbes, and then the major figures in the modern period are usually Hans Morgenthau, E.H. Carr, Reinhold Niebuhr, and up to the neo-realists, Kenneth Waltz and John Mearsheimer. So one narrative says this is a very ancient tradition. It's homogeneous. It hasn't really changed very much, and it's that unchangingness which gives it its moral capital, right? Its prestige. The second narrative is one that says, no, actually, realism's effective history is much more recent. The major figures who made realism a central part of U.S. foreign policy were German emigres. So everyone knows about Henry Kissinger, but slightly less well known is Hans Morgenthau, the author of the canonical works that made realism a recognizable public philosophy in the United States. So while I admire greatly the scholarship that has spoken about the Germanization of the American mind, one thinks of Udi Greenberg's work on the Weimar century, or Nicolas Guyot's wonderful works on the history of mid-20th century realism, including the role of the Rockefeller Foundation, or William Scheuermann's extraordinary work on Morgenthau and others. So and then also there's Marty Koskanimi, who also wrote an important piece on Morgenthau and the history of international law. So I build on those. I'm not overturning that argument, but I am trying to supplement the emphasis on the generation of the 1930s by relocating the origins of a lot of what I argue is, our habits of thought in realism, both in the academy and in the public sphere, by relocating the origins to the 1890s. Now, how do I do that? Well, I argue that realism is less the sort of tragic fruit of liberalism's collapse in the 20th century and the need for liberalism to be less feckless, to have a more clear-eyed sense of power, but rather that realism is the ideology of two rising empires. And so by relocating, the history to the turn of the century, to inter-imperial competition, I'm able to show how much more closely realism is linked to discourses of classical geopolitics. I was astonished to find that the historiography of geopolitics is wholly distinct, or was until my book, wholly distinct from the historiography on realism, right? Realism starts around 1930. Classical geopolitics is the 1880 to 1900 period. And a figure like Mahan, who I treat as an early realist, what I call the first member of the first generation of Atlantic Realists, is always described as a proto-realist or someone who has an instinctive realism, but he's not really a realist. So I'm making I'm shifting the narrative, and then I make this methodological move, which is to say that I feel that realism is a kind of mutation in thought, that something happens between about 1895 and 1900, where you have German and American intellectuals looking across the Atlantic, trying to grapple with the requirements of great power status, which seem to have changed from simply being a continental power to being a power with overseas colonies. And this is the discourse of Weltpolitik in Germany, and being a world power, which is a new concept in US discourse at the turn of the century. And I make the argument that this kind of mutation in thought, which produces a lot of modern realist discourse on international relations, comes from that realism originates from a practice of comparison, a practice of two nations engaging in imperial comparison and saying, well, what are our prerogatives as empires? What's reasonable? And the way this plays out in the book is that I argue that, a figure like Carl Schmitt is looking explicitly at the Monroe Doctrine and taking America as America's Monroe Doctrine, the idea of a sphere of influence, as a model for German hegemony in Europe. I'll just say two other things about the overall argument, which, as I indicated at the beginning, is a bit of a complex argument. I'm also trying to argue for the asynchronous development of realism in the United States and Germany. This is a longue durée history. I go from 1880 to 1985. And what I'm trying to show is that the US-German relationship has always been important for conditioning the global language of realism, right? So it may look like a global paradigm that's unmoored and anyone can have it. You can be a realist in China or Russia. But I argue that the US-German dialogue over a century has a particular, unavoidably important, it puts its stamp on this tradition more than other national traditions, more than British, more than French. So it's also an argument about the affinity, the strange affinity between the US and Germany, which are two countries who historians are often tempted to treat as exceptional. There's the American exceptionalists, empire by invitation. There's the German exceptionalism. The Nazism is sort of hardwired into the German Sonderweg. And what I was trying to show is that there's a common Atlantic context for these empires. They have something in common, and by comparing themselves across the Atlantic, they arrive at certain standards for what is reasonable and realistic for an imperial power. And my argument is that that realism is a kind of seeing like an empire, a way of seeing that has come down to us and which we have not fully recognized the historical baggage of this realist tradition. So that's my effort at an overview. Yeah.
That's really helpful, Matthew. One of the things I greatly appreciated, in fact, was the methodological care with which you took on this this thesis in this area. So one of the things you did by bringing the origins of realism, saying it's not a timeless tradition that goes back to Thucydides on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's not just the tragic fruit of the failures of liberalism in Europe in the 1930s, and instead you located in the 1890s. And one of the things I appreciated methodologically about what you do with the book is you have the receipts. First of all, you create a new archive of the history of realism by looking at all of these theorists in the late 19th century in Germany and in the United States, and you enroll people who aren't normally thought as realists at all, necessarily, like Frederick Jackson Turner, whose famous frontier thesis in 1893 is part of what sets up the notion of space. There's a spatiality to your argument that I think is really important, the sense of what the right way to think about imperial space, spheres of influence, the need for Lebensraum, the idea of gross realm. All of these are really important elements for you. But I think what is remarkable about the book, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about this specifically, is the way you show that these were actually people who are in direct dialogue with one another. This is not just the seminar in the sky of realists that go back to Thucydides and connect forward to today with 99-year-old Henry Kissinger, who have all been in one dialogue. These are people who are actually in dialogue, exchanging letters, thinking together, evolving their ideas together. Talk a little bit about the social networks, both within Germany and within the United States, but also across the Atlantic, that helped create this tradition that goes back from the 1890s down to the present day.
Yeah, thanks, Nils. I mean, this is a work of transnational contextual intellectual history. It's not comparative history. It's not simply, two parallel stories and then me as the narrator drawing some comparative. It's showing that there actually are these social networks. So, for example, Ellen Semple, the president of the American Association of Geographers, a graduate of Vassar who went to Germany, to Leipzig, to study with Friedrich Ratzel in the 1890s. Who was Ratzel? Ratzel had coined the term Lebensraum, which of course becomes so important in the Third Reich. But Ratzel himself had traveled extensively in the United States and was a great admirer of American Lebensraum. And so what I was trying to do was show that there's this that the story about the Germanization of the American mind misses the fact that this is a bi-directional story, right? You have German intellectuals learning from America. There's a very important reception history to Alfred Mahan's writings, or you have Emperor Wilhelm II, translating Mahan. And so I try to go deep into, what the German naval strategists are talking about, and then you have a figure like Paul Reinsch, who is a professor at the University of Wisconsin. He's actually he ends up as an ambassador to China under Woodrow Wilson. He's one of the first presidents of the American Political Science Association, and he's the first person in the United States to offer a course with the title Worldpolitik. And we know what I show is that Reinsch is in Germany at that exact moment of the discussion of Weltpolitik. Now, what is Weltpolitik? It's basically Germany deciding that they are now interested in colonies. Under Bismarckian Realpolitik, but Germany was much more inward focused and much more interested in maintaining the equilibrium of a balance of power between different alliances and sort of moving the chess pieces around. And Reinsch says, Weltpolitik is very different than Realpolitik. Weltpolitik is a much more optimistic and aggressive philosophy. It's not about simply maintaining balance. It's about gaining space. It's a much more social Darwinian view of the contest over space. And it relies on this idea of a closing of global frontiers because the Earth is being colonized, right? And this is a common theme to Mackinder and Mahan and so forth. So in the late 19th century, I'm trying to show that Germans are reading Americans, Americans are reading Germans, and then I sort of follow that up until, at another point in the book, I try to show that there's the transnational conversation about the meaning of geopolitics, and there's this kind of funny, one of my favorite parts of the book is that even Reader's Digest and Hollywood got in on this. Life magazine by putting Karl Haushofer, doing a big spread on Karl Haushofer. So who was Karl Haushofer? He was someone who was an academic geopolitician, a general in World War One. He actually tutored Hitler in Landsberg prison and, brought him Ratzel and the idea of Lebensraum. So why was Life magazine thinking about this crazy German guy? And basically, they argued that geopolitics was some kind of Nazi superweapon. It was a super science, and we had to be really worried about it. But we also had to avoid, it was contaminated. Like, you're not supposed to be geopolitical. And what I show in one of my chapters is that there's this remarkable pivot within the space of just a few years, because of the end of the war and the advent of the Cold War. A lot of American intellectuals, sort of get over their allergy, their animus, their fear of being geopolitical, and they say, actually, it's no longer this Nazi super weapon, this essentially problematic tradition. We should be geopolitical too. And I sort of show that a figure like Father Edmund Walsh, who's the creator, one of the creators of Georgetown's School of Foreign Service, has been reading Haushofer for 20 years and actually goes and, has a face-to-face meeting with him in Germany before it takes his last testament, down before Haushofer commits suicide. So it's those kind of those kind of direct connections that I was interested in tracking.
So I think one of the things I really also appreciate about this is that, there's a tradition you were bringing up reception histories of receptions being ideas moving from one space to another, right, and unidirectionally, and that sort of diffusionist narrative about ideas, I think, has been undone by a lot of scholarship in a lot of different directions, in terms of the turn towards the global, historiographically over the last 20 years. Your, in this sense, fits into, I think, several other recent works, a tradition that's emerging. I'm thinking here, for example, of Lawrence Scaff's book on Max Weber in America, about the impact of American ideas on Weber's own thought, or Whitman's book on Hitler's American model. That also is, I think, a really important book for showing the way in which ideas about America and policy in America was also influencing the Germans. It wasn't just Germans coming to America and influencing. It's not just the Germanization of the American mind, as you were saying. It's also the Americanization of the German mind. And I think this is part of the subtlety of what you're doing here is really important. I want to turn now to talking about a little bit more personally. There's a lot of you in this book, and one of the things I really appreciate about this book was that it's a personal book in many ways. Maybe a way I can cut into this is by asking you, anytime we write a book, one of my principles as an intellectual historian, and your book actually here instantiates this, is that intellectuals are primarily reacting to the writing of other intellectuals. They're also reacting to things that are going on in the world around them. Like, that's why you choose to write a book is partly a result of things that you think are going on in the world that need to be commented on, but often immediately prompted by reading other intellectuals and scholars who are writing things. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you felt like this book was the book you needed to write now. Your last book was a wonderful intellectual biography of Habermas. That's a very, writing an intellectual biography is a very different kind of methodological project than what you were doing here. And I'm wondering why you decided to make this the next project. Why was this the book project that needed to be written now?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really nice question to have the opportunity to answer. I mean, basically, the roots go back to the era of the War on Terror and the Bush administration's, insane decision to invade Iraq and in 2003, and at that time, there were a lot of people who were trying to make sense of the Bush administration's neoconservatism, and a lot of people were making reference to Carl Schmitt as a kind of explanatory, that Schmitt, that Bush the younger was speaking about you're either with us or you're against us. And this, for a lot of people, this recalled the friend-foe definition of politics from Carl Schmitt. Of course, when the war in Iraq was depicted as a war to liberate and a war in the name of human rights, many on the left began to quote Schmitt, who I think is quoting Proudhon, but he who invokes humanity wants to cheat, right? And so what I noticed was that there was a good case to be made for a Schmittianism of the right, sort of the neocons around Bush, but also there was an uptake of Schmitt on the left by people who were skeptical of the NATO mission in Yugoslavia in 1999 or the Iraq War, the kind of military humanism. And I was troubled by that uptake of Schmitt on the left, and I wrote something for the Oxford Handbook of Carl Schmitt. And as you say, intellectuals react to other intellectuals or are motivated by them. One of the arguments that I found, that I found troubling at that time was from Chantal Mouffe, who was arguing essentially that the only adequate solution or response for the left to American unipolarity was Grossraum, right? Was sort of a multipolar world order in which Russia gets to kind of control its sphere and China gets its sphere and so forth. So there was a and I was coming from Habermas, and Habermas, of course, had always been very critical of Schmitt, and so I was interested in tracking this Schmittianism in U.S. foreign policy. And then, of course, I found the writings of Marty Koskanimi and others. Alphonse Zollner was a very early person who wrote about Morgenthau, basically, my interest in Morgenthau and realism dated back to my undergraduate days, where this is the mid 80s during the Cold War, where I found that the realism of Kissinger and Morgenthau seemed to me to be really the major obstacle to the kind of politics that I wanted to see in the world. So, why couldn't we lobby to get Mandela out of prison? Because South Africa will go communist. It's simply not in the national interest. We need, so the whole notion of allying with anti-communist dictators was framed by this idea of the national interest and realism. So I had a long-standing animus to realism. It kind of was exacerbated by the war on terror and the Iraq War, and sort of trying to take that forward. And then of course, then there was my interest. Then it became a question of wrestling with, I wanted a canonical figure I could sort of sink my teeth into, and it was Morgenthau. And here he was, this German emigre who I thought could sort of, because he was very influenced by Schmitt, but he's also a Jew. He's not a Nazi, he's a Jew, he's a liberal, he's very good on civil rights, he opposed the Vietnam War. He was a very rich character to begin exploring the complexity of realism. And there are, of course, there are many realists today who will say, well, I don't want anything, I don't agree with Mearsheimer, and I think neorealism is problematic, but I want to go back to the classical realists and to Morgenthau. And, I think one thing that I was really writing against in this book, but not with hatred, with sort of more ambivalence, was that I don't like the revisionist Morgenthau. I don't like the idea of Morgenthau as a good liberal Democrat. He feared the demos. He was, wanted to insulate foreign policy, the art of judgment and statesmanship from, the ordinary person. And I think he constructed an idea of power politics, of scientific man versus power politics, which essentially reifies politics and power as something sort of outside of history, as something ineffable that can never really be mastered. And I just don't find that to be very helpful.
This is talking about maybe what realism is today. I find it very interesting that you brought up the Iraq War as sort of a motivation to do this now. I mean, the Iraq War is now almost 20 years, or the beginning of the Iraq War is almost 20 years ago. And in fact, it's interesting that you think of this as an exercise in realism. I think one of the great historical conundra of the 21st century will be explaining why the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. And there are almost, in my view, too many reasons. People have said, oh, it was just about the oil, or oh, it was an Oedipal thing about Bush Jr. wanting to make up for the fact that Saddam had tried to assassinate his father, or oh, it was about a liberal vision of remaking the Middle East, or neocon agenda for one thing or another, or oh, it was an apology for getting rid of an enemy of Israel. And maybe all of these things are correct on some level, right? One of the things, so the war in Iraq, while simultaneously an incredibly irrational and terrible decision in American foreign policy, was also radically overdetermined on some fundamental level. And maybe only because it was so radically overdetermined was it possible to make such a catastrophically bad move. And I wonder whether in the contemporary moment, people are going to look back on the Russian invasion of Ukraine this year in similar terms as a war of choice by an ostensible quote unquote great power, which is a term that comes out of the realist tradition, against a supposedly minor power that was supposed to go really well, but in fact ends up completely blowing up in the face of the supposedly cold-blooded realists who were prosecuting and having the idea for this war. I don't know if you want to go to the comparison of the Iraq and Ukraine, but I'm interested if you want to comment on sort of the way in which realism is only one motivational thread that's going into these kinds of decisions at any given time.
Okay, well, let me start by saying that I started thinking about Schmitt and Morgenthau in 2003, 2004, but I didn't start working on the book until much later. And in terms of the Iraq War, I'm not sure I would characterize it as a realist war. I mean, the realists of the time, Stephen Walt, John Mearsheimer, were all opposed to the war. Condoleezza Rice, Brent Scowcroft, Colin Powell, those realists actually said, if you break it, you buy it. This is not necessary. You're going to create a power vacuum. And so there was a kind of prudential realist argument. And I remember, there was an article back then called Weighing Iraq on Morgenthau's Scale. And basically the argument was this is not in the national interest, right? So the national interest and realism can be very helpful for, restraining the overreaching. But as you say, I think, in the case of Ukraine, I think this is a kind of Machtpolitik, completely unfettered. It's certainly not Realpolitik. It's not about balance. I think Putin, he played his hand very strangely. He was in a position to probably achieve the neutrality of NATO by negotiation. There was, in this case, what's motivating Putin, I think, is a different kind of realism, which is the realism of great powers. And it's partly nourished by emotions. He's not the rational strategist. He is, he often speaks about Russia needs to rise from its knees. It was humiliated by the West. It needs to re-achieve greatness. And he's decided that great powers get to do that. And my problem with realists like John Mearsheimer is that while they say they're not trying to condone great powers doing what they will in, with their sphere of influence, they afford no normative perspective by which to critique it. And they also, by naturalizing all of this, by saying, look, this is the way great powers behave, this is what science tells us, this is what history tells us, you'd be a fool to step out of line with that. You'd be a fool to insist on something as quaint as Ukrainian right to national self-determination. That's my beef with realism.
For those of you who are following along online, you can put questions in the or on YouTube rather. You can put questions in the box, and I will transmit those to Matthew. We'll start questions in maybe 7 or 8 minutes. One of the things that I find really interesting about reading this book is that you also reconstruct how realism, while often represented by its practitioners as a single tradition, in fact is a number of different traditions. You were talking about a pragmatic realism versus a hardline realism. There are all these sort of sub-flavors of realism. It's a plural tradition. And one of the things I came away from the book thinking about is that realists always like to present themselves as we're hard-headed, we're scientific, we have a correct, if tragic, understanding of human nature, as opposed to all you soft-headed other people. But actually, in many, many cases, especially when there's hard cases in international affairs, realists as a group don't actually have either a consensus position on what to do. In other words, you can find realists on both sides of the argument for many, many key foreign policy issues. And they actually usually don't find themselves having, because of that, clear leverage for critiquing any particular policy position. So there's this weird way in which realism becomes a form of like masculine self-fashioning, and you do bring up the gendered aspect of this, I think, very effectively in the book, rather than actually an analytic tool that like helps you clearly delineate between things we're going to do and things we're not going to do. I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to do more with gender, but what I noticed was that, there's a lot of, the realists are speaking about statesmen in all male spaces, right? And Morgenthau was someone who had engaged in dueling in his German fraternities. And, if you look at, and there's a lot of Max Weber in, here I stand, I can do no other, the phrase from Luther, there's a kind of, there's a kind of stoicism and masculine rhetoric in realism. There's also a lot of metaphors of the face, and one thing that might not be clear to our listeners is that this may sound like an IR book, or it may sound like a kind of transnational history of empire, and it is trying to do those things. But I'm also a closet literary critic. And, I really like reading texts closely. And so I'm really interested in metaphor. I'm really interested in when Morgenthau talks about facing realities. Mahan has the same image of you've got to face reality. So all this imagery of the face, of clear-sightedness, there's a lot of visual register stuff. And what's so amazing about it is that, here we are in 2022 or whatever it is, postmodern, relativistic, none of us are scientific realists, right? None of us are philosophical realists. We know how complicated it is to represent the world. And yet you have this very primitive kind of mimetic realism in that there is one way to see the world, to face up to the realities, right? And so, I just find it realism very under-theorized. It trades on all of these old tropes about reality versus illusion, and hard-headedness versus soft-heartedness, and rationality versus emotion, and so forth. Sorry, I forgot the beginning of the question.
Well, I just, whether, I guess my bigger question, or not bigger, but the question I have in terms of what the current salience of this set of ideas are for
Right.
policy today is, given that we end up with realists people who call themselves realists, who are recognized by other realists as realists, end up on both sides of an argument for every major foreign policy question of the day, suggests that there's maybe not as much analytic purchase in the
right. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So I think there's a kind of interesting problem of that realism is the practice is either over-determined by the theory or under-determined. So the practice is over-determined by the theory when you basically say this is how great powers behave, and therefore our task as statesmen, the task of practice, of foreign policy practice, is to simply align ourselves with the inexorable forces, right? So if great power competition and multipolarity is the real that we have to accommodate ourselves, then the realist is supposed to simply subordinate their practice to theory, right? It's just do what science says. The alternative is to think of realism more as an art of judgment, right? An art as opposed to a science. And I was really interested to see, there's been a lot of talk of realism because of the Ukraine war, and there was an article by a very smart, important realist, political scientist named Paul Post at Chicago, and he wrote an article in Foreign Affairs in which he says, realism is not a coherent theory, it's basically an attitude, a baseline. And I thought, well, that's great. I'm glad we've shed the hubris of realism being a science that we all have to get on board with. But if it's just an attitude, then it's very underdetermined. So I feel like we have a choice between realism in two flavors, either too thick or too thin. Either it's too thick because it's got all of this imperial stuff, now euphemistically called great power privilege or great power rivalry, or it's too thin. It's basically what Obama said, don't do stupid stuff.
Right.
So,
yeah, I mean, and I'll just give another example to me of where the slipperiness of realism as a tradition comes in. Let's take another example in contemporary foreign policy. What should be the US policy with respect to Taiwan? I mean, this is second to Ukraine, probably the most live issue for foreign policy right now. You can make a realist argument that, Taiwan is part of China, you don't have to buy China's argument that it's part of China, but it's certainly been part of China's sphere of influence. We have to recognize that China has fundamental interest there. The US interest relative to the Chinese interest is clearly much lower. Their commitment level is going to be much higher. So we should just, so that can become a realist rationalization for basically abandoning support for Taiwan. But you could also make a, quote, realist argument, it seems to me, that says, actually, the boundaries of the spheres of influence is the nature of great power struggle. That's the ontological reality, is that, Russia's sphere of influence reached all the way to, almost to the North Sea until 1989. And it was drawn back all the way to, Belarus, the Polish border anyways. And now they're trying to push back. And the same thing could be said for China, that China is just trying to, enlarge its sphere of influence, and that as a realist, recognize there's no reason for us to allow another great power to expand its own Lebensraum, its own gross realm, if you will, at our expense, because ours has expanded. And so it seems to me you can make both arguments on realist terms. And if you can make both arguments on realist terms, what is the realism doing for you, really?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, you can read Foreign Affairs and find realists who have different positions on Taiwan. I think Charles Glazer says basically we need to exercise restraint and sort of recognize that this is basically China's sphere, and we have no business there. We should retrench. And then you have other, I think it's Oriana Schuyler Mastro, and some other realists, Mearsheimer, of course, who argue for a much more confrontational posture. I mean, I have it in for the realists, so, I have an axe to grind. And it's been nice getting a little bit of pushback because, I don't want to be too dismissive of this tradition. I mean, in a way, my response is usually to say, why do you need to read, why do we need a theory with scientific pretensions to tell us not to have hubris, right? So, you can sort of go the scientific route and say, the international system exercises these deep constraints on state action. But I think the constructivists have kind of, blown a lot of holes in that neo-realistic model of the world as simply a scientifically explicable, system. So then, the people who don't want to defend scientific realism go to classical realism. E.H. Carr was someone who, had advocated appeasement of Hitler in his classic work. But there are other moments in Carr. I'm in discussion with a lot of people about, how do you build a progressive realism, right? And I don't rule that out as a possibility. I think it's interesting to try and think that way, to try and use realist insights. For example, I know one colleague in Washington, D.C., who argues that realism points towards the necessity of world government, right? That if anarchy and all of this is what this inevitable clash of national interests is what we have, and we need to deal with the Anthropocene and the planetary. Well, guess what? That's a kind of realist. So that would be a kind of progressive realism. William Scheuermann, who's a friend, who's someone I greatly admire and learned a tremendous amount from, wrote a biography of Morgenthau, argues that the tension between realists and cosmopolitans is wholly overstated. So, I'm skeptical that that the classical realists have a monopoly on, the kind of the arcana of statesmanship, right? But if you want to read, if you're Obama and you like reading Niebuhr because it's like reading Marcus Aurelius or something, it's some poetry that speaks to you, that gives you a sense of your own, the potential for things to go wrong. That's not harmful. But what's harmful is when you sort of build all the classical realism, all the prestige of art, right? And all the prestige of science into this big tradition, and then you feel handicapped by it because it tells you that it's illusory to think in terms beyond in unconventional terms, right? That's my beef. Is that so it's it's a kind of I'm trying to do a kind of a ground clearing operation. I don't have the answers for what comes next. I don't have, this is certainly not a plea for liberal internationalism. It should not be misread that way. I see liberal internationalism and realism as two faces of empire. I don't have the answer what comes next or what's better, but I do think it's very clear what the limitations of realism are if you look at Ukraine, for example.
Yeah, I'm personally not sure we can ever get outside imperial frames at all. The book I'm working on myself right now is, in fact, making a set of claims that we need a set of planetary institutions to deal with planetary challenges. And I draw on arguments from constructivist, cosmopolitan internationalist, and realist arguments to make that. And I say, people say it's unrealistic to imagine that we could have a set of institutions that would be where nation states would be willing to give up parts of their sovereignty too. And I said, is that more unrealistic than imagining nations will just allow themselves to burn and drown in the rising seas and rising temperatures? I'm not sure, right? There's a question from the audience that I want to pose to you, because that's going to the larger level, a cosmopolitan realism or a planetary realism. And in fact, some of the work that we do at the Institute is specifically called planetary realism. But let's go the other direction. Is there a realism and this is the question from the audience, is there a realism from the perspective of minor powers? For example, what is the realist position for Taiwan vis-a-vis China? What's the realist position for Ukraine relative to Russia? Is realism always seeing like an empire? Or can we imagine a, quote, minor realism in the same sense as we talk about minor literature?
Oh, wow. I love that question. I think we need a lot more attention to the perspective of small states in our historiography, for starters. I'll sort of answer your question sort of obliquely. One of the problems with Waltz's account of neorealism was that it was a kind of that bipolarity had created a nice, stable world order, and that we would miss bipolarity when the Soviet Union collapsed. Well, that didn't say very much about, the 200 million people who died in the Cold War. The Cold War was not peaceful. It was violent for the global, for 99%, for people in the global South. And in terms of a realism of small powers, there are examples in history of small powers trying to negotiate a role for themselves, an outsized role for themselves. So I think of Yugoslavia during the Cold War, which had a lot of tried to conduct, or successfully conducted an independent foreign policy in places like Angola and elsewhere. Is realism irrelevant to the Ukrainian leadership or the Taiwanese leadership? That's a great question. Probably not. I think certainly, first of all, it would be helpful in assessing the way of seeing of your adversary. But it might, for example, I don't know. I can imagine, for example, that it might be useful to know if you're Ukraine, and I think Zelensky's been incredibly skilled at this actually, is how do you make arguments that will appeal to the, quote, realism of your allies? It's one thing to understand the realistic about what Putin's intentions are, but where it might be particularly useful for Zelensky, and I think he's done this, I don't know if he's done this in a theorized way, but he's certainly done it very effectively, is he's made arguments that appeal to national interests. He's sort of said pretty explicitly, we'd like to be part of your sphere of interest, not their sphere of interest, and so on and so forth. So I think that there might be a way in which, as an analytic frame of the way in which great powers may style themselves, partly because of the theory, this would be the constructivist take, right? It might be useful for somebody like Zelensky or the Prime Minister of Taiwan to think in those terms. And I think to answer maybe more definitively, I would say that small states can conduct a realistic foreign policy without realism.
That's true too. You brought up Yugoslavia
without realism per se, right? As a tradition, as a science, as a canon.
If fundamentally what it is about having a tragic sensibility and a clear-eyed view of power, if that's really the reduced element of the realist tradition, again, maybe you don't need that. Maybe you don't need, quote, realism to get that. Let me pose the last question. We only have a couple of minutes left here, Matthew. You brought up Yugoslavia during the Cold War. Yugoslavia, Tito famously was one of the major spearhead figures behind the non-aligned movement, which was, of course, an exertion primarily, or not primarily, but certainly centrally about asserting the importance of sovereignty for countries in the global South, what eventually sort of evolved into what today is known as the G77. And I wonder whether, is that a version of the realism of cities, countries from the South or small states? Would you say that the absolute commitment to sovereignty is a assertion of realism by smaller countries and countries in the global south?
Well, certainly wielding the OPEC instrument was a realist move, or a power political move. Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in. I mean, one of the big claims of my book is that realism should be provincialized, that it has these Euro-Atlantic origins, and it is this kind of, it has empire in its DNA, and it's not terribly useful for export. But as some of my interlocutors have pointed out, if that's the case, why is it so popular in China and Russia? And I think my answer would be that this is the global circulation of a language. And, you know, China is a rising power, so it's not surprising that they would cathect onto another tradition that was born as the discourse of a rising power. Yeah, no, in terms of sovereignty, I'm not sure I see much affinity between global South defense of sovereignty and realism. I mean, certainly a realist like Kissinger was, you know, very threatened by the new international economic order and tried to was concerned that it would break up the kind of great power condominium, you know, which is
that he was aiming for with détente, for sure.
Right, exactly.
Well, we're almost at the top of the hour. I want to say thank you, Matthew, first of all, for writing such a great book, and second of all, for inviting me to have this really fun conversation with you. I hope this book gets a wide reception. It's already gotten reviewed nicely in several different places and high-end journals by realists and critics alike. And you've gotten, I think, you've really done a wonderful job with this book of summarizing and providing a new kind of history that enriches, I believe, the way the realists themselves should understand their own tradition. So I think you should be congratulated for this, and thank you so much for being in dialogue with me today. Thank you. That means the world to me. It's, you know, it's a history with political and moral intent, and I'm delighted to be part of the conversation. So thank you, and thank Townsend for this opportunity.